They thought the fire would erase Varys Harmon, that the smoke would silence my name, my empire, my very breath. But when the flames died, it wasn't me left in ashes. It was them. And when the courtroom screens lit up with the heat signatures, their faces burned across the evidence. Richard Harmon, Martin Harmon, my husband, my brother-in-law. The men who tried to kill me became the architects of their own ruin. Their greed became my revenge. My name is Varys Harmon. I am 58 years old. For decades, I built a real estate empire in Westchester. I raised buildings out of dirt, carved neighborhoods from empty land, shaped a city that bore my name. People called me powerful. They called me untouchable. Yet inside my own home, betrayal was quietly breathing, waiting for its chance. I lived in a mansion perched high above the Hudson. To the world, it was a palace of marble and glass. To me, it had begun to feel like a cage. The chandeliers sparkled. The fireplaces burned. The gardens bloomed in perfect rows. But under that beauty, silence pressed heavy against my chest. Richard Harmon, my husband, 60 years old, charming in public, sharp in business, but bitter in private. He smiled at parties, raised glasses with my partners, yet I saw the shadows in his eyes, resentment, envy. He hated that my name carried more weight than his. Martin Harmon, his younger brother, 55, always lurking at the edges of family gatherings, playing the loyal uncle, the quiet advisor, but his smiles were too quick, his handshakes too soft, and his eyes hungry. At first I ignored it. I wanted to believe family was sacred, but the air in the mansion changed. Papers went missing from my desk. Documents I had never signed appeared in locked drawers. I passed Richard's office late at night and heard his voice, low, urgent, over the phone. I remember one evening clearly. "Everything is almost ready," he whispered. The floor creaked beneath my step. He turned, startled, and then forced a smile. "Just business, Varys," he said. "Nothing important." But I knew better. Wives always know. Martin began visiting more often. Too often. He and Richard shut themselves in the library, voices hushed, laughter muffled. When I entered, they stopped speaking. Their eyes followed me until I left. Only then did the whispers return. One afternoon, I found a folder left open on the table. Deeds, transfers, company names I didn't recognize. My signature printed neatly at the bottom of pages I had never touched. My chest tightened as I read. When I confronted Richard, his face hardened. "You have no idea what it takes to protect what's ours," he snapped. "What you mean," I answered quietly, "is what's mine." He said nothing. His silence was confirmation. From that moment, I began to watch more closely. Every glance, every word, every shadow. The mansion no longer felt like a home. It felt like a stage. And I, unknowingly, had become the target of the performance. At night, I walked through the halls alone. The marble floors echoed under my steps. The chandeliers flickered like eyes. The air was cold, as if the house itself knew what was coming. I looked at the portraits on the walls, Harmon faces smiling down at me, and I wondered how many secrets had lived inside these walls before mine. I told myself I was ready, but nothing could prepare me for the fire. That night still lives in my bones, the night when the walls of my home glowed red, when the silence of betrayal became the roar of flames. But that night was not my ending. It was my beginning. Because while Richard and Martin believed they had erased me, they had only given me something greater. Proof, resolve. A hunger colder and sharper than theirs could ever be. I am Varys Harmon. I built empires from the ground, and when they tried to burn me to ashes, they forgot one thing. I know how to rise. Richard and Martin grew closer, too close. Their laughter carried through the halls, soft at first, then sharper, as if mocking me. I would find them together in the library, the door half closed, their voices low. When I entered, silence. The air would change, and Martin's smile, too polite, too thin, would follow me until I left. I told myself it was nothing, but night after night I heard Richard on the phone. His voice dropped to a whisper, urgent, like a man gambling everything. One night, I pressed my ear to the door. "Yes, it will all be under our control soon," he murmured. My heart clenched. The floor creaked beneath me, and he opened the door suddenly. His eyes flickered with panic, then softened into charm. "Can't sleep?" he asked too casually. "What are you hiding, Richard?" I asked. "Just business, Varys," he said, smiling thinly. "Always business." But his voice betrayed him, and I walked away knowing it was more. Martin began staying late. Papers shifted from my desk to his hands without explanation. I once caught him in my study. He closed the drawer quickly, forcing a laugh. "I was just looking for Richard's notes," he said. But the papers on the desk told another story. My name printed across contracts I had never seen. My signature, perfectly forged. The walls of the mansion seemed to lean closer every day. The chandeliers above, once glittering, now felt like eyes. The portraits on the walls stared down with judgment, as if they knew what was unfolding. Meals at the dining table turned into silent wars. Richard's fork against his plate, sharp and deliberate. Martin sipping his wine, watching me over the rim of the glass. I sat in silence, pretending not to notice. But every glance they shared was a dagger. I began to doubt everything. The documents I had signed, the meetings I had missed, the whispers that filled the night when the house should have been asleep. And still, I had no proof, only shadows, only suspicion. At night, I lay awake in the master bedroom, staring at the ceiling. I replayed every word, every silence, every look. The house that once felt like mine was turning against me. I walked the halls, the cold marble echoing under my feet. I pressed my hand against the polished banister of the grand staircase, and it felt foreign, like it belonged to them already. Richard smiled at me differently now, less warmth, more triumph. And Martin lingered too close, his voice dripping with false care. "You've been under so much stress, Varys. Maybe you should let Richard handle the paperwork." I looked at him, steady. "Maybe I should," I said softly. But inside, my stomach twisted with rage. Even the staff had begun to change. Servants who once greeted me with warmth now shifted uneasily, their eyes darting toward Richard before they spoke. It was as if the walls themselves had taken sides. I realized that loyalty, too, had a price, and Richard was paying it. I knew something was happening. I knew they were moving in the dark, rewriting my life on paper I had never touched. But the truth was still beyond my reach. I was trapped in a house of whispers, and I was alone. And deep inside, a question gnawed at me every night. How long before shadows turned into flames? The night began in silence, a stillness that pressed against the walls like a warning, the kind of silence that carries weight, the kind that hides behind doors and waits for its moment. I walked through the house, the mansion gleaming as always. The chandeliers sparkled, the marble floors glowed beneath the dim lights. But something felt wrong, too quiet, too still. Later I would learn the truth. Richard and Martin had planned every detail, a faulty wire, a staged spark, a carefully crafted accident. They thought no one would question it. They thought fire would erase me, and their path to my empire would be clean. I was in my bedroom when the first scent reached me. Not the warmth of the fireplace, but the sting of gasoline. Sharp, bitter herb, impossible to mistake. I froze, and then the alarms screamed. Not the house alarms. Those were under Richard's control, but my alarms. The system only I knew. Hidden thermal cameras, independent smoke sensors, a silent signal that lit up on my tablet, glowing red. I rushed to the screen, and there they were. Two figures moving through the hallways, heat signatures glowing against the darkness. Richard's broad shoulders, the tilt of Martin's head, cans of accelerant in their hands. My blood turned cold. My heart did not race. It hardened. The house shuddered with the roar of flames. Wood cracked, glass shattered. Heat pushed against my skin as the fire spread faster than any accident could. I opened the back stairwell door and smoke poured out like a wave. Coughing, choking, I pulled my sleeve over my mouth and forced my body forward. The hall behind me was swallowed in fire. The walls glowed orange. The paintings blistered and fell. The mansion I had built, the empire I had raised, was burning, and I knew whose hands held the match. I stumbled through the smoke, the floor trembling under my feet. Down the narrow passage, every step a battle. My lungs seared, my eyes watered, but I did not stop. Outside, the night air cut sharp against my skin. I collapsed into the garden, gulping the cold air as if it were life itself. Behind me, the mansion roared, a beast alive with fire. Windows burst open, vomiting flames into the night sky. Then I saw them. Richard Martin, standing at the edge of the driveway, faces painted with shock. Too much shock. Too perfectly timed. Richard ran toward me, his voice raised. "Varese! My God, are you all right?" I looked into his eyes. There was no fear for me, only fear that I had lived. Martin arrived seconds later, panting, clutching his chest. "This is terrible. How could this happen?" I said nothing. I let them play their roles. The grieving husband, the horrified brother. The fire trucks arrived. Sirens cut the night open. The mansion hissed and screamed as water struck the flames. But I knew the truth, and the truth lived in my hands, in the footage locked inside my private system. That night, standing in the garden as the smoke rose into the stars, something inside me shifted. The woman who had trusted, the woman who had believed in family, she was gone. What remained was sharper, colder, unbreakable. I whispered to myself, my voice steady even as the world burned around me. "You wanted me erased, but I'm still here. And now, it's my turn." From that night forward, survival was no longer enough. I would rise from the ashes, not as a victim, but as their reckoning. And for the first time in my life, I welcomed the fire. After the fire, the mansion was nothing but a shell of blackened stone. And yet Richard and Martin stood by my side, playing their parts to perfection. Richard held my hand in public, squeezing it just tightly enough for the cameras. "My poor Varese," he whispered for others to hear. "You've lost everything." Martin visited often, carrying flowers, bringing wine, pretending concern. "You're strong," he said with that thin smile. "But maybe you should let us handle things now. Rest. Heal." They cloaked themselves in sympathy. To the world, they were my protectors, but I saw through it. Behind their worried glances, I saw calculation. Behind their comforting words, I heard the clink of coins. I stayed silent. I let them believe I was broken. I let them believe the fire had stolen my will. I never spoke of the cameras. I never mentioned the footage burned into my tablet, their faces glowing orange as they carried fuel through the halls. That secret was mine, and I intended to keep it until the perfect moment. Instead, I played the role they wrote for me, the grieving wife, the shaken sister-in-law, the woman who smiled weakly and whispered, "Thank you for taking care of me." But silence is not weakness. Silence is a weapon. I met Chloe Myers in a quiet office far from Westchester, a lawyer with eyes sharp as glass, her voice calm but firm. She listened to every detail, every suspicion, every name. When I handed her the first copy of the footage, her lips tightened into a smile. "This," she said, "is not just evidence. It's a death sentence. For them." Daniel Cross joined us days later, a private investigator with a patience that matched my own. He traced accounts, followed paper trails, lifted stones until every worm underneath writhed in the light. "Shell companies," he told me one evening, sliding a file across the table. "Property transfers. Forged signatures. It's all here. They're bleeding your empire dry, Varese." I looked at the pages, my name printed again and again where my pen had never touched. For a moment, anger surged so strongly I could hardly breathe, but then I smiled. "Let them think they're winning," I said, "because when the fall comes, it will be from the highest peak." So I returned to the mansion ruins with Richard at my side, leaning into his arm as if I needed it. I let my hands tremble. I let my voice falter. "I don't know what I'd do without you," I whispered. He kissed my forehead, the act so tender the world might have believed it. But his eyes betrayed his hunger. Martin followed, his voice low in the hallway. "She's weaker than ever. It's almost done." He thought I didn't hear, but I heard everything. Each word, each lie, each plan, and I stored them inside me, waiting for the right moment to let them burn. I was no longer simply Varys Harmon, the woman who built empires from stone and glass. I had become something else, a shadow moving quietly, a flame hidden beneath ash, patient and steady. They thought they had erased me. They thought my silence was surrender, but silence was my disguise, and soon it would become their undoing. Daniel's investigation unfolded like a map of rot. One shell company after another, empty names, empty addresses, all tied back to Richard and Martin. They had built a web, thin enough to be invisible, strong enough to strangle me if I wasn't careful. But webs work both ways, and I was ready to make them choke on their own threads. Late at night, I sat with Chloe in her office, files spread across the desk like a battlefield. She pointed at the papers. "This is enough to raise questions," she said, "but not enough to bury them." I leaned back, my eyes steady. Then we let them bury themselves. So I began the game. I moved part of my holdings into a hidden trust, silent, untouchable. To Richard and Martin, those assets simply vanished, like crumbs swept off the table. Their calls grew sharper, their meetings longer. I knew because my cameras never stopped watching. Richard pacing, anger etched into his face. "She's weaker than ever, and still things are slipping through our fingers." Martin's voice, calm but venomous. "We just need her to sign the final documents. Once she does, everything falls into place." And so, I gave them what they wanted. One evening, Richard arrived with a folder. "Just routine," he said. His smile was too polished, too hungry. "You don't even have to read it, Varys. Trust me." I let my hand tremble. I let my breath catch, and I signed. He leaned down, kissed my cheek. "See? That wasn't so hard." But he didn't know those papers were worthless. Drafts crafted by Chloe, built to look authentic, yet holding no legal weight. Ink without teeth. To Richard and Martin, though, it was victory, and victory made them careless. The cameras caught them celebrating, glasses raised, laughter sharp as knives. "She's finished," Martin said. "She doesn't even realize she's already handed it all to us." But I realized everything, and I had every word recorded. Meanwhile, Daniel followed the money. Every account, every offshore transfer. He brought me ledgers, pages heavy with their greed. "They think the net is tightening around you," he told me, "but they don't see the rope is around their own necks." I smiled. They won't see until it's too late. At home, I continued my role, my shoulders hunched, my voice soft. "You know best, Richard," I murmured, letting him believe he was winning. He stroked my hand, smug. "Don't worry, Varys. Soon you'll have nothing to worry about." But in his eyes, I saw it. The gleam of triumph, the arrogance of a man blind to the cliff beneath his feet. And Martin, always near, always watching. "Rest, Varys," he told me one evening. "Let us carry this burden." I looked at him, nodded faintly. "Yes, I'll let you carry it." Inside, my rage burned brighter, because what they carried was no longer my burden. It was their doom. The footage piled higher each day, meetings whispered in the library, calls made under the cover of midnight. Every lie, every plan, every stolen word, captured by lenses they thought were dead. And I watched it all, patient, silent. They believed I had surrendered, but every stroke of my pen, every smile I gave, was a blade I was placing carefully into their hands, because soon I would force them to cut themselves with it. The moment had come to turn the tide. I could not strike yet, but I could loosen the ground beneath their feet. So I spread a rumor, a whisper placed in the right ears. I told a few trusted contacts that I was considering selling part of my holdings, a quiet retreat, a graceful exit for a woman too shaken by tragedy to fight anymore. The story moved like smoke, and soon it drifted back to Richard and Martin. Richard stormed into the study, his face flushed with rage. She's going to sell? After everything we've done to control this? Martin tried to calm him, but his mask slipped. She won't go through with it. We'll push the papers faster. She signs, and it's over. I watch them through the hidden cameras, their voices sharp, their tempers raw. Richard slammed a glass against the table, the shards scattering across the floor. This fire was supposed to end it. She was supposed to be finished. Martin leaned closer, his voice low but vicious. Then we'll finish it ourselves. One more transfer, one more step. And there it was, the words I had been waiting for, the truth spilling from their own mouths, recorded in perfect detail. I sat in the dark that night, watching the footage replay again and again. Two men so sure of their power, confessing without even realizing it. It was almost poetic, betrayal captured not by force, but by their own arrogance. But evidence is only power when the world sees it. And so I began to pull at the threads of their reputation. A whisper to a journalist here, an anonymous envelope there. Not the full story, just fragments. The idea of false companies, the suggestion of fraud, the hint that the fire was not an accident at all. And soon, the press began to circle. Articles appeared, cautious at first. Questions surround Harmon finances, unusual insurance patterns after Westchester Blaze. I watched Richard read one of them at breakfast. His hand tightened around the paper until it crumpled. "This is nonsense," he growled. Martin poured more coffee, his smile thin, brittle. "The media feeds on speculation. Ignore it. We're untouchable." But I saw the flicker in his eyes, the smallest shadow of doubt. They reassured each other, blind to the storm rising around them. But outside the mansion walls, whispers grew louder. Investors called with hesitation in their voices. Some postponed meetings. Others asked subtle questions Richard could not answer. Neighbors watched me differently, leaning closer, lowering their voices when my name was mentioned. The air was thick with doubt, and I fed it, carefully, patiently. The cameras caught Richard's temper flaring more often now. Documents slammed against the desk. Wine glasses shattered in anger. His mask was cracking. Martin tried to keep him steady, but his own calm was fraying. He snapped at staff, barked orders, retreated into rooms to whisper over the phone. And all of it, every moment, was recorded. Richard still strutted through the house, convinced he was in control. Martin still smirked, sure of his cleverness, but I could feel it. The circle tightening, the walls closing in. They thought I was cornered. They thought I was playing the victim. But I had already changed the rules. Every word they spoke, every secret they spilled, was no longer theirs to protect. It was mine. Piece by piece, I was feeding it to the world that would one day watch them burn. They didn't see it yet. Not Richard with his arrogance, not Martin with his careful lies. But soon, they would. And when they finally looked up, they would realize the trap had already closed. The courthouse was overflowing. Reporters crowded the steps. Cameras flashed like lightning in a storm. Everyone wanted a glimpse of the Harmon family drama. Wealth, betrayal, fire. Inside, the air was heavy. Packed rows, the hum of whispers, and at the center of it all, Richard and Martin. They walked in with heads high, suits pressed, smiles carefully practiced. Richard straightened his tie, his eyes sweeping the room. "She has nothing," he whispered to Martin. Martin smirked. "She's desperate. This will end in smoke, just like the fire." I sat quietly at my table, my hands folded, Chloe at my side, calm as steel. Daniel behind us, files stacked like weapons. The judge entered, the gavel struck, the noise died, and the game began. The prosecution opened with routine words, speculation of faulty wiring, an accident. Exactly the story Richard and Martin had built. Richard leaned back, confident. Martin scribbled notes he didn't need. To them, this was theater, and they were winning. But then Chloe rose. Her voice cut clean through the silence. "Your Honor, the defense would like to present Exhibit A." The lights dimmed. The screen flickered on. At first, only shadows, then heat blooming across the screen. 2 figures glowing against the darkness of my home. Orange silhouettes moving through the halls, gas cans in their hands, fire erupting in their wake. And then, face Richard Martin, clear, unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed. Richard leapt to his feet. "This is fabricated," he shouted. Martin's voice cracked. "A trick! This proves nothing." But Chloe did not flinch. "Exhibit B," she said smoothly. Daniel stepped forward. He laid down file after file, each thicker than the last. Shell companies, forged signatures, money funneled through fake accounts, ledgers so detailed they told the story better than words ever could. Richard's face paled. Martin's hand shook as he tried to gather the papers, scattering them across the table. And then came the final blow. Representatives from the Securities and Exchange Commission rose, their voices steady, merciless. "These documents have been verified by our office. The companies in question are confirmed fraudulent. The transfers were orchestrated by Richard and Martin Harmon." The courtroom erupted. Whispers, gasps, the clicking frenzy of cameras. The world was watching their empire collapse. Richard slammed his fist against the table. "She set this up. She trapped us." The judge banged the gavel. "Order." "The evidence speaks for itself, Mr. Harmon." Martin's voice broke. "This isn't justice. This is revenge." I looked at him then, not with anger, not with pity, with finality. "You're right," I whispered. "It is revenge. And it's also the truth." The gavel struck again, echoing like thunder. Order returned, but their masks were gone. I watched the arrogance drain from Richard's face. I saw the smirk crumble from Martin's lips. Men who once believed they controlled everything now sat in ruins, stripped bare before the world. For months, I had carried fire in my chest. Now, in this courtroom, I let it burn them instead. And as the evidence piled high, as their voices faltered and broke, I knew this was the moment they realized there was no escape. Not from the law, not from the truth, not from me. The courtroom was silent when the gavel fell. The sound cracked like thunder, rolling across the walls, leaving no space for denial. The judge's voice carried with finality. Richard Harmon, Martin Harmon, guilty of arson, guilty of financial fraud. The words echoed, final, unyielding. I watched as Richard's shoulders collapsed beneath the weight of the verdict. His suit still perfect, his hair still combed, but his power gone. Martin slumped beside him, his face pale, his eyes darting as if searching for a door that no longer existed. There was no door, no escape, no empire left to protect them. The judge continued. All assets acquired through fraudulent means will be seized. The Harmon companies dissolved. The properties frozen until further notice. Gasps filled the room. Reporters scribbled madly, flashes stinging the air like lightning. The Harmon name, once spoken with wealth and respect, was now drenched in scandal, soaked in disgrace. Richard turned toward me, his voice a hiss of venom and desperation. "You did this to me." I met his gaze and spoke softly, so only he could hear. "No, Richard, you did this to yourself." Martin's fists pounded the table, his voice breaking. "This isn't justice. It's revenge." I let the words hang in the air. He was right. It was both. Justice and revenge, bound together like flame and smoke. When the trial ended, I walked out of the courthouse. The cold air hit my face, sharp, bracing, clean. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward, questions hurled like stones. "Mrs. Harmon, how do you feel? Do you believe justice was served? Will you rebuild?" I gave them no answer, only silence. A silence stronger than words, a silence that told them everything. For the first time in months, I felt weight lift from my chest. I was no longer a victim of betrayal. I was no longer the woman left to burn in her own home. I was something else now, a woman who carried fire in her veins, a woman who had survived and avenged. Days later, I returned to Westchester. to the ruins of the mansion. The once proud walls stood charred and broken, reaching for the sky like bones of a fallen giant. I walked through the ash, each step stirring memories. The smell of smoke still lingered, sharp, bitter. I ran my fingers along a scorched wall, the stone rough beneath my skin. I closed my eyes and saw it all again. The flames, the betrayal, the men who thought I would die here. And then I opened my eyes. I was still standing, and they were gone. I placed my hand on the wall and whispered to the ruins, "You tried to bury me in ashes, but this is where I was reborn." The wind howled through the broken windows. The setting sun painted the rubble gold as if the house itself was blessing my survival. I stood tall in the shadow of what was once mine, knowing that from destruction I had carved power. They wanted me erased. Instead, I became unforgettable. I turned toward the horizon, my voice steady, my heart unshaken. Fire can burn houses to the ground, but truth and justice never die. You tried to bury me in ashes. Instead, you crowned me in flames. And with those words, I walked away from the ruins, not broken, not burned, but reborn.